Hi, everybody, and welcome to 2025. I am excited. We are almost fully back in Parliament. We resume on the week of the 28th of January, but we've been doing a lot of work in preparing. We've been spending a lot of time speaking to South Africans about the various issues that they want us to tackle this year. So I'm excited. I'm excited also because this is the year we get to have our first full year in Parliament. And I think we've seen some progress in the fights that we've been fighting for the better good of the country last year. And I think we're going to see even more of that this year. South Africa is always an exciting place to be. So it is exciting to be doing work for and with South Africans. So my kids are growing up. My son turned 16 this week. We celebrated as a family. And I realized, no, we're growing up. We're growing up. We've got a whole 16-year-old in the house. He's in grade 10 this year. I saw some of the books. I was going through some of the books that he's doing for English. They have exciting stuff, man, compared to us. He's got Purple Hibiscus. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie is one of my favorite books. She's one of my favorite authors. And some other really good books. So excited to see him grow, excited for his academic year. And then our second born and last born is 11 this year. He's in grade 6. He is very serious. He's like grade 6 is a serious year. And he's not someone who's always been serious about school. He's very clever. So he tends to just do well without trying too hard. But he's quite serious this year. So that's been good to see. And I hope that it lasts. But otherwise, I'm wishing you all of the best for this year. And I certainly hope that this is a good year for the country and we start to see things change and turn around. Otherwise, there's been lots of conversation already and lots of happenings in the world. In the first month of the year, certainly Trump's inauguration has been interesting and has got us reflecting and thinking about a number of things. And one of these things is the issue of transformation. You know, with Trump having had some executive orders, some of which include pretty much the abolishment of the DEI policy, which is the diversity, equity, and inclusion policy. We have to reflect and think about these things. I think that DEI policy has been very, very important in starting to see transformation in the United States, particularly for minorities, particularly for women. There's been changes in the number of minorities and women who actually are getting higher education. There's been changes and there's been improvement in the number of minorities and women that are in senior positions. And you've started to see some improvement just in the economic condition of those groupings. But there's still such a long way to go. So for me, it is concerning that you would abolish a policy like DEI. And we have to watch very closely to see if there are policies that make up for that so that you don't see a regression in the improvement that you've seen. But I'm joined today by Fiona.
Hello, thank you.
I thought let's actually have some conversations. And I mean, Fiona and I often chat about things and, you know, we go back and forth having discussions. And I thought, no. Bring those conversations here. Let's talk here. Let's do it here. So we're going to be focused today quite a bit on transformation. What does it mean in the South African context, you know, and how should we be doing it?
Yeah, I find it very interesting that in the same week, Trump signed to abolish the DEI in America, and Parks Tau obviously signed almost the opposite here in South Africa with the Transformation Fund. I know you have questions around it. And rightly so, because you sit on the Committee for Trade and Industry. So you are right in the middle of all of that. So if anybody has the right to literally pile in, because everyone, when things like this happen, everyone has an opinion. Everyone. And I must say, I often feel quite embarrassed on behalf of white people. I'm not going to lie, when everyone's like, oh, but it's not fair. And I think the problem is white people in this country don't understand how much harder it is for, you know, even for people living in a township and people living in a formerly white area, the school you go to, your access to a job, there's so many different, you know, things. And the first thing, you know, you read online in the complaint section is white people complaining, oh, this again, oh, that. So So, and I want to start by saying, arguments I've had and hate mail I've had online by saying it will never be as difficult for white people to get a job in South Africa as it was for Black people during the apartheid pre-94, first of all. Secondly, there were plenty of jobs to go around. It's just that as white people, we can't assume we're going to walk into the best one, just soma, So, I don't think it's necessarily, BEE is necessarily a bad thing because the playing field had to be even. However, it's the implementation of, and I think that's where I was so excited when you got onto the Committee for Trade and Industry, because it's like you know what needs to be done properly, effectively, implement things properly, and the importance of it, not just as other political parties. We're like, scrap it, it's not fair. Yeah. Because that is not fair. The scrapping of it is not fair. So let's start with your knee-jerk when you saw the transformation fund, because I know you had your initial thing was
Yeah. Look, we've spoken a lot, and even in our policy and manifesto, have advocated for what we call the Jobs and Justice Fund. And for us, that is about saying, instead of having a framework or policy like BBBEE, which actually ultimately in its implementation has ended up benefiting only a few, have a fund that is directed at South Africans who are wanting to access opportunity in the economy. So South Africans who want to build businesses. And in our instance, as Build One South Africa, we're saying particularly those who are wanting to build in townships, that who are wanting to build businesses in townships. We're saying that particularly those who fall under PDIs, previously disadvantaged, as we used to call it, people in this country. So the reality that I always say is that what BBBEE did, part of the problem, is that it looked at an already concentrated and very limited mainstream economy. So it looked at what primarily and fundamentally you'd call for ease of reference, mostly industry, corporate, and looked at that and said, let's see, how do we, first of all, make sure that there's inclusion in employment? But when it comes to ownership, how do we make sure that those who are previously economically disadvantaged can have a piece of the pie? Now, the reality is that there is very little of that pie to go around. And you are going to end up with only a few people being able to, at least from a perspective of ownership, have a piece of that pie. And then who do those people end up being? Those who are politically connected. Because there's gains for business to be able to, accommodate those kind of people who are politically connected. And because some of these deals happened at a time where those who would have access to the conversations about those deals would be those who are elite, politically connected, etc. So that is the first issue with what happens. You have an issue with ownership that says you are limited in how many people can ultimately have a piece of the pie. And when it comes to employment, you have a reality where you look at how BBBEE is set up, and it's easy to be able to take a group of Black, colored Indian people and put them in a certain level of the organization to make sure that you reach your numbers. But you find that when it actually comes to proper executive decision-making, you're not really seeing the transformation.
And also, a lot of the big corporates in South Africa are guilty of putting Black, colored Indian people in the soft place. So
absolutely,
human resources, marketing,
not finance,
and not the big ones that really count. And it's very common across a lot of the big corporates. It's still the finance, and the big ones are still white men, and very often Afrikaans white men.
So that becomes the issue. Sorry, I just want to then say the second issue then becomes that you have the BEE Commission that is then supposed to oversee the implementation of BEE in the marketplace. And that is something that I've found, particularly within the working within the Trade and Industry Portfolio Committee, that commission does not have teeth to bite. It doesn't have the resources that it needs, and it also doesn't have the authority, actually, that it needs to make sure that BBBEE is implemented properly without the things you're speaking about, without it just being a window dressing kind of practice. So that is another issue. So then when you look at this transformation fund, to your question about my knee-jerk reaction is, we have a transformation fund, but it's still going to be operating within the framework of BBBEE, which very clearly has not worked. If you look at the number of people in South Africa that are Black, Coloured and Indian that are unemployed, those are the highest percentages.
Yeah.
And so how then is it working if that grouping is still the most disadvantaged when it comes to employment opportunity? When you look at poverty, the poverty line, and who sits below the poverty line, it's Black people that sit below the poverty line. So is there economic transformation when you're looking at that? When you look at ownership of business in this country, you will be shocked to learn that actually it is still very majority white owned, very much so. Look at the companies that are listed on the JSE, and I can tell you now, less than 1% of those companies listed on the JSE are Black owned. So really, if you are still going to be using the same framework, it doesn't matter how much money you collect in a fund, you can't still be operating within that same framework.
Yeah. And also, you get that almost Black elite. It used to be called with the Black Diamonds and there's so many derogatory names for it. But that just gets the gap is getting bigger.
Absolutely.
So it's not necessarily working. However, in my opinion, I still believe it is important because we still need to level the playing field.
Oh, yes.
Let's talk about SMMEs and township economy.
Yeah.
And that idea that township economy is spazza shops and shebeens,
Yes.
When we look at SMMEs, particularly within the townships.
Yeah.
From a trade and industry point of view, what do you believe needs to be done?
So before we get to that, and I'll tell you that now, I want to pick up on something you said in the beginning.
Yeah.
And that is the fact that it is still important to make sure that we have economic redress.
Yeah.
For me, I have a very personal experience, and I always share it, of growing up as a child who lived between two worlds, of growing up as a child who was living in a township. And because my parents, at then, it was the late 80s, early 90s, had figured that, actually, for our child to have an opportunity and a future in this country, it can't be through Bantu education.
Yeah.
It can't be through the education system that is limited, that we are limited to as Black people. And so I went to then private schools, which were the only ones which would take a Black child, because the other white schools obviously were government schools, and they were segregated based on race. And so every day traveling between these two places, traveling between the township and the suburb, and obviously it's a high-end suburb because it's a private school, I saw the discrepancies that existed. We had to leave from home very early in the morning, probably like 5 o'clock. I'm not a morning person, and I think it has a lot to do with that. The fact that I was waking up at ridiculous hours to go to school. And so I had to wake up that early and travel, between this world that just changes as I get to my destination. My parents had to travel into work as well. This idea of the segregated life is very, I grew up with it. And so when we were even conceptualizing Build One South Africa, for me, the idea of building one South Africa is about building a South Africa where there's one education system, where there's one economic system, and that is still so segregated even today. I, a couple of years ago, played this game called, it's a version of Monopoly called Unequal, right? Where we played Monopoly, and there was the first group. The first group gets to roll the dice and play as you would. Every time they go around, they collect 20,000, and etc., etc., etc. I was in the second group. Second group rolls the dice for a couple of rounds, but we don't get to move. So you roll the dice. And I mean, I was lucky. I kept rolling doubles. And, I was like, if I was playing,
you'd be,
I'd be moving.
Yeah.
I'd be advancing, And so there were 2 rounds that we played like that. And then after 2 whole rounds, we then got to move. Okay, fine. So now suddenly we can actually move. But the others already have, the first group already has
property.
Yeah. They already have advantage. They're already moving. But okay, so now I'm playing, and no matter how well, and I was still getting the doubles, no matter how well our group was playing, we could never catch up with the group that had 2 rounds ahead of us. Then we played a couple of more rounds, and then all of a sudden, the instructor goes, okay, stop. Everybody's now equal. Because even in the rounds we were playing, we weren't allowed to collect 20,000. So it's like now the rules are the same for everybody. Now we're all equal.
But they already have the stuff. They already have. And it's
just like in 1994.
Yeah.
Where it was like, stop the bus. Everybody get on. We're now equal. But the reality is, and playing that game, I remember actually crying. Because I saw a reality that is so real of, then all of a sudden we were equal. But there is still so far for us to go. And what it looks like in reality for a Black person in South Africa who then has had some sort of progress, and so is the so-called Black Diamond, you speak of the middle class South African, is that we still bear a burden of, you still have relatives that you must take care of. You still, what it means is that there's still so many of us that still have to come along, that the responsibility of having to make sure you bring everybody along, but also that you're starting as a first generation for some people of property ownership. For some people, you're starting as a first generation graduate. In my family, my mom was the first generation graduate. And so you are a first generation professional was my mom. Before that, my grand was a domestic worker. And so, it just means you have so much more to do in catching up. And so to your point about the need for economic redress, there is a need for economic redress, because you can talk about equality, but there's no equity. You're not starting from the same point, and you have to help the group that was left behind to kind of catch up to the same point. Before I get to your SMME thing, I just wanted to say that before I get to how I think we do this, I just wanted to share that and just the case.
Yeah.
The case for the fact that we need it. And, like you said, often it's difficult to get white South Africans to understand that.
I think when I read a saying once, and I can't remember exactly what it is, but in a nutshell, they were saying, when you have had extreme privilege your whole life and someone else is given a chance,
it feels like oppression.
It feels like it's being taken away from you.
Yeah.
And, I think I am very fortunate because I grew up in Botswana and I'm, and Irish and everything. So I come in with a slightly different mindset, but look at and listen to white people in South Africa and think, guys, you don't understand the privilege that you have.
Yeah.
And you don't understand that idea that the playing field needs to be even. I always think of post-World War II in Nazi Germany. There was a massive education drive after that war to tell German people what were done. And what was done in there, over 2 million Jewish people were sent to extermination camps. A lot of the, people ended up with wealth they should not have had, with property they should not have had. A lot of people, so people who said, oh, but I didn't know that. But that wasn't done for me. It was drummed into German people like it was done for you.
Yeah.
It was done because you were told you were the Aryan race. You were told you were the chosen people. And actually you weren't. And the problem with South Africa is it did not happen here. And white people, because I mean, I remember 94 because that's how old I am. We went into this beautiful rainbow nation, and no one can take that away from Nelson Mandela because we were on the verge of a civil war in this country, which is the only reason F.W. de Klerk, gave it over. It wasn't a beautiful altruistic moment where he realized, it was, oh, sorry about that, guys. It was, it had to happen. Change had to happen. And that's what happened. But it was a dire situation. And Mandela did that one term, and he did say, I will only do one term. And he facilitated a really peaceful transformation, which was beautiful. However, white people went in like, yeah, we're Rainbow Day. Let's be friends. Lovely, lovely. I'm not giving you any of my stuff. I'm not, we'll allow a few of your black children into our white schools. And that was the kind of attitude. But no one was told, actually, not a lot of white people went into townships and went, oh, this is how different your life has been to mine up to now. And and unfortunately that, the next generation has come up still believing that.
Yeah.
And the next generation now are coming up going, oh, but you're taking, that's not fair that I don't have BEE. And they don't actually look at, well, jobs are being reserved for black candidates, possibly. However, you went to a Model C school and have, had a much better head start than the candidate who is. So it's this is what I believe needs to happen. I think a lot of, if white people are brave enough to have that conversation and acknowledge that privilege, then it's easier to understand why triple BEE is so important.
Well, let's say why economic transformation
is important. Yes.
It does not necessarily need to look like that policy, which I don't believe is serving the broader black community anyway in the way that it should. And to your point, I think what's important is that it ultimately cannot be oppressive as well.
Yeah.
It's got to be empowering and it's got to be leveling the playing fields, but it mustn't be oppressive. And I think that's where we need to have the conversation of what does it look like when transformation results in equality without being oppressive. But and it leads me to your point of what do I think needs to happen. So I will consistently say we need to look beyond what we currently have as the mainstream economy. I think we need to be creating new industries and focused on new industries. I think we need to be expanding where economic activity takes place. Currently, it's concentrated either in industrial areas or in areas that have been commercially zoned for a long time. It's concentrated mostly in suburban areas. We need to talk about in CBDs in town. We need to talk about how do we expand the economy. That's the first. And how do we make sure that in the process of that expansion, we are expanding the scope of ownership to include Black, Coloured and Indian people more. That JSE figure of less than 1% Black-owned companies on the JSE is scary. Yeah. So how do you then make sure? And that is why we, as Build One South Africa, continue and will always advocate for and intend to get into government and implement special economic zones being in strategic townships.
Okay, so let's get to the fundamental, the practicalities of it. You've got a young person in the township, or any age, I suppose, who wants to be an entrepreneur. They want to open a, let's say, panel beaters or auto shop. And how would you, if you were the Minister for Trade and Industry, if we said, Park, sit down, buddy, would just turn, what would you do to get that? Because I think it's more than just hand over startup cash.
No, it's certainly more than that.
Yeah.
First of all, it's making sure that you have an enabling environment. So you need to make sure that you're working on infrastructure that sits, and not only in just townships and rural areas as well, because there's a lot you can do. We're talking right now about alternative energy, and there is great opportunity to build up capacity for alternative energy, for instance, in rural areas. There are various industries that could operate really well in rural areas. But you have to make sure that you have the infrastructure, the roads, the energy, the water, the digital infrastructure that allows for this to happen as a start in supporting that. The reason we talk about special economic zones is that you can also then make sure that there are various benefits and incentives that can be given to businesses, to investors that then engage in business in those areas. You can also make sure that there are incentives for that young person who then hires within that community in building that business. And yes, funding is a part of it. You set up and you prioritize specific industries that you fund that are set up in those areas, because obviously special economic zones generally have like an industry focus. And you know that in this area, in this township, we are focused on manufacturing. In this area or in this township, we're focused on research and innovation. In this area, we are focused on digital commerce and et cetera, et cetera. And so that is the way that you can make it practically work. So when we talk about the Jobs and Justice Fund, that would be the work of the Jobs and Justice Fund, ensuring that you're able to fund that young entrepreneur that wants to start a factory and making sure that you're able to incentivize that young person and any other person that will fall within the value chain, any other business that will fall within the value chain, even a business that isn't operating in the area, but that will fall within the value chain, any investor that will be investing in that area, and that entrepreneur themselves, and making sure that they're hiring the people in that area. And in that way, you start to increase ownership. And in that way, you are growing an economy. You are growing new industries. In that way, you are creating employment. But not only that, you're dealing with the spatial justice issue, because you then have spaces that have been developed that actually do have the infrastructure that they should have anyway, and that have employment so people can live where they work.
Even that building of infrastructure in itself is an economic plan. Even that, 100%. If you look at after the Great Depression in America, FDR came in and that whole New Deal thing where he said, we're going to pump money into America. Like, that's mad. No one's got money. It's like, but in doing so, building the roads, building the infrastructure, getting it in there, creates jobs. 100%. So it's the gift that keeps giving. Your policy is the gift that keeps giving.
It's the gift that keeps giving.
Let's talk about training as well. So for young entrepreneurs, they have a wonderful idea. They've got the startup, but the actual fundamentals of running a business. What would your answer be for that? For the actual help of the daily operations?
That absolutely falls within. The special economic zone type of criteria, which says that there has to be training in that specific industry that SEZ is focused on for the people that are employed in those areas. And that's critical because you also then, South Africa is 107 out of 147 when it comes to the Global Skills Index. We have a real skills shortage. It's a very real issue in South Africa. You start to deal with the skills issue. We have close to 70% unemployed youth. And part of the issue is that of skills. There are other issues, economic issues that exist in the creation of jobs, which is what we're talking about here. Yeah. But there's also the issue of skills. And so you then deal with that as well.
You know, we talk about, if you have a look through history, throughout history, all countries that have had large and violent coup d'etats happened because there was a very large unemployed youth. So as South Africa, we cannot afford not to upskill the youth. We cannot afford to have 70% unemployment within the youth. So because that is when an uprising will happen.
Absolutely. That is when an uprising will happen. And also we live in a continent where the youth is the biggest common population group. Yeah. And so if you're saying youth are unskilled, if you're saying they're unemployed, what is South Africa, what is Africa looking like in the next 10, 20 years?
Yeah. And what other options do the youth have? I mean, if you don't upskill the youth, what other options do they have except to uprise? So you get other countries where throughout Africa where they are using tech and innovation and really streets ahead of us. Even if we've got sort of Nigeria, Ghana, a whole lot of other countries are really enabling the youth to go out and achieve. But South Africa are not. That brings me nicely around then. We are talking about transformation in South Africa to the DEI conversation and Trump scrapping that. It's not the right time to take pot shots at Donald Trump, which is not what we're doing right now. However, it is there was a lot of things that he signed away on day one, and I think a lot of it was the drama of it. A lot of it was the photo op, and I'm in here, I'm making stuff happen from the start. But DEI, we are very fortunate in South Africa with our constitution. So human rights and women's rights are enshrined in our constitution. So, women in South Africa have the right to earn the same as men. We don't understand how unequal it is in America. So women's rights take a back seat, but more so, African Americans are so much more disadvantaged than your white Americans. And the whole of society is structured to keep it that way. So the DEI, I will let you, or I will ask you your opinion. I see you.
Yeah, no. So it's really sad. I think it's sad. That's why I'm saying we must wait and watch and see if there are other policies that will be introduced that will counteract the loss of DEI.
Yeah. Because
you still have a situation where minorities, where Latinos, where African Americans are still economically disadvantaged in many ways, and in many instances even marginalized. And so you still do, and women, and so you still do need to solve for that.
Yeah.
And you still do need to level that playing field. I mean, when you look at the history of African Americans in the US and, working in the cotton fields, slavery, when you look back, even then you get into the 1940s, 50s, where, only then are they starting to be able to go into colleges, and even then there are limitations to that.
Yeah.
The kind of work that they could access at that time, it is not very long ago.
No, even up to the 1960s and 70s.
It is not very long ago. And so you can't have, and then women, and their ability to access economic opportunity, it's not very long ago. And so there's no way you've closed that gap. And when you look at the numbers, you haven't closed that gap. So we're watching. To see, I'm watching to see and hoping that there is policy that will buffer the effect of the loss of DI.
Interesting, the wildfires in Los Angeles, or the whole of California actually, recently, the sort of not necessarily Trump administration, but it was repeated by them, but the right-wing media blamed it on the fire chief in LA, who is a white woman lesbian, and it was her fault the fires got out of control, according to these people. And I thought therein is exactly this. So it's a DEI, she's a DEI appointee, and I wonder, not climate change, because
we still have
not climate change, because that was the other thing that Trump was signing away, climate accords.
We still have a long way to go generally in the world.
Yeah.
When it comes to that idea that when somebody who is a woman, when somebody who is, just different from the typical picture of who should be economically active in the world, when that person is in a role, anything that happens, is their fault, becomes exaggerated in terms of their responsibility for it. And, it's something we need to continue to fight against, just generally in the world.
Yeah. How can young entrepreneurs, and like particularly you talk about township economy, young entrepreneurs in the township who have great ideas and want to partake of the SMME program, how can they contact you?
So I'm starting a series of dialogues with SMMEs. I am next week in George.
Okay.
So on the 28th of January, I'm in George speaking to SMME owners in George. And then on the 10th of February, I have a dialogue in Gauteng, where we'll be engaging with small business owners in Gauteng. We're talking to them about all sorts of things. We want them to bring their issues. And somebody asked on Twitter, but do you not know about the issues that SMME has? I mean, I have been an entrepreneur most of my, adult life, and have worked with enterprise development and small business. So I do know the issues. But here's the thing. I want to hear them from you, and I want to be mandated by the business owners and saying this is what we want as a first. Secondly, you want particular patterns. You want to pick up particular patterns with specific institutions. You want to be able to pick up, okay, so there's an issue with this institution which sits in the ecosystem and is supposed to be solving the issues of SMMEs. Let's direct our efforts towards that. So that's absolutely why we want to talk to SMMEs. But we also want to share. We want to share what the work that we've been doing. We want to share this policy that I've just shared with you now, and we want to get more thinking about that and into that. So absolutely. So we will be engaging. I'll be engaging throughout the year with SMME owners, with young entrepreneurs throughout the year, and that's how it starts. Starts on the 28th of January in George, on the 10th of Feb in Gauteng. People can look out for our social media updates on that as well.
And email, if there's somebody who's not in George or Gauteng, someone wants to email you or get in touch with you in general.
Absolutely. You can email me at nwebster@parliament.gov.za, or you can email me at nobuntu@bosa.org.za, and we can chat about all things, particularly all things small business, all things trade and industry, all things entrepreneurship.
Lovely. Thank you for inviting me for this chat.
Thank you for being on the chats. I think we must do it like this more often. I've enjoyed our chats.
Lovely.